Hello, Music Theory 1 students. This is the first of 3 videos I am going to create instead of having our in-person meeting during week 9. This week is the first of 3 weeks. So week 9 is the first of 3 weeks where we'll be studying chapter 12. And I've basically divided the 3 weeks into 3 parts, of course, very obviously. This first part is focused on the authentic cadence, as well as some of the basics of tonality and how to think now in tonality and how we analyze using in tonal music. So it's called tonic confirmation because confirming the tonic it was one of the major thoughts or kind of the major goal in tonal music is that we all revolve around the tonic. And I'll talk more about this in the in-person class on Monday. So I wanted to first start about some basics. Some of you will probably know this already because this is very much a part of what tonal music and studying is, but I wanted to make sure we had the basics of Roman numerals down first. So the first thing you do need to know is that in tonality, we have chords and we name those chords in a very specific way. The way that they're defined, and the terms tonic, supertonic, mediant, subdominant, dominant, submediant, and leading tone or subtonic, you'll see in minor here, should be something that you know already. If it isn't, it's fine. We're introducing it here. But what we do is these chords are created from scale degrees, right? So if the bass or if the lowest note in the chord is scale degree 1 and you have a triad built above that, then that's a tonic triad. Then we have a supertonic triad, a mediant triad, and so forth, all built on the scale degrees of the major or the minor scales. They all have a quality. Okay, so of course, when we're in major, our tonic is major, but then we have our 2 chord, I'll call it a 2 chord, sometimes 2, or our supertonic is minor, our 3 chord or mediant is minor, our subdominant is major, our dominant is major, our submediant or 6 chord is minor, and our leading tone chord is diminished. Okay, so that's important to remember. That's in major. In minor, of course, it's kind of like these things flip. Because what was major before becomes minor. What was minor generally becomes major, except you'll see in 2 instances, the supertonic in minor is now diminished. So the 2 chord in minor is diminished. You really have to keep that in mind because remember, like chapter 8 says, whenever you have a diminished triad, it cannot be in root position, but you can use it in first inversion. I'm going to talk about that more on my next slide here. So our supertonic here is diminished, and our subtonic, we now have a subtonic and not a leading tone chord, because when we build chords in minor, we first build them on the natural scale. Okay, and so building that in the natural scale means that our 6th and our 7th scale degrees compared to the major are lowered, right? So we have 6 is major and 7 is also major. Okay, it's built on, and in this case, we're in A minor, so it's built on G. So we just have a G, B, D chord, and that is a major chord. Okay, let me move to the next slide here. Chords that can be used in a tonal homophony are all of those above and them in first inversion. So remember, basically a triad and a triad that's in first inversion is all that you can use, except, of course, the leading tone chord in major and the supertonic or the 2 chord in minor. So you can't use the root position triad because it's diminished, but you are very welcome again to use that chord in first inversion. And this is going to be important. Both of those chords are pretty important chords in our tonal homophony. Now I want to talk about 2 other things. First, you'll notice that this might be different for some of you, that in the Horton and Ritchie textbook for the Roman numerals, they just use uppercase Roman numerals. That doesn't mean these are all major triads. What it means is they don't associate quality of the chord with what the Roman numeral looks like. If you like to do that, so notice in tonic, I have the other options below. So if it's diminished or minor, it could be lowercase Roman numerals. If you want to use that in these chapters 12 and on, because now we'll be in tonality, you can. You just need to be consistent. So I know this really well. If you, for instance, use the 2 Roman numeral when you're doing your analysis, and you use it in minor, and then sorry, we're in major and you use 2 for minor and you use 6 using the Horton and Ritchie major, I am going to mark this one wrong because you started to show me that you're using the lowercase ones. So I would say if you're worried about this, just simply use always uppercase for the Roman numerals because it matches what the Horton and Ritchie textbook does. They're assuming that you do have in mind that in major 2 is minor, right? And 6 is minor and 3 is minor. And in minor, we have, that 3 is major anyway, so that they're hoping that you're going to keep in mind and get used to that. The other thing I want to talk about in this video, and this is where we'll end this video, is that each of these chords have a purpose within tonality. So we can divide all the chords in major and in minor into 3 categories. The first and the most important is the tonic, and the tonic is what everything revolves around. So the first is tonic. And the chords that we think about being in tonic, and I'm actually going to write on here. So the tonic I'm going to show in blue, right? So our tonic chords here, this is tonic function. So this is the function of the chords, okay? So our tonic, of course, is what we start and end on, and it's in blue. But sometimes the submediant can sub in, okay? So it can also be tonic function. But mostly it's the one, and we'll talk about that more in week 10 when we talk about prolongations, because when we're talking about final cadences, the only chord that can be the tonic in a final cadence progression, so this is the authentic cadence at the very end, is our tonic. But sometimes in prolongations within the music, we are going to see a submediant substitute for our tonic. The next function that we have, and in this case, I'm going to use red. Oh, I don't want that to change now. So the next one that we can use, or the next function, is our dominant function. Okay, and so our dominance function is, of course, our dominant chords, but also, at least in major, our leading tone chords. Okay. The final function is predominant. Now, I'm going to divide this into 2 subcategories. Okay, so we have the and I'm going to use kind of let's use a darker green. There are the predominants, and we call these cadential predominants. The cadential predominants are the predominants we use at the final cadence or at the authentic cadence. And these are very limited, okay? So you can either use the supertonic, you can use the subdominant, and sometimes these prolongations are called subdominant dominant tonic because the 4 chord is used almost more than anything else. But you can also use the submediant. Okay, so I always call these the cheering chords. The cadential predominants are our cheering chords because it's 2, 4, 6, right? So 2, 4, and 6 would be your kind of, they cheer on and they point to the dominant, and then the dominant then points to the tonic. So there's ways that moves through. Now you'll notice I'm in major, and I only have the mediant in major, at least, doesn't seem to have any function. Well, that's because in the Horton and Ritchie now, we also have something that we call an elaborative chord. When you've taken theory before, maybe you've only talked about predominance, dominance, and tonics. And often it's called like PD, so predominant to D, which is dominant, to tonic, which would be to T, which would be tonic. So PD, D, T, if you want to think about it with sort of short form. But there's a bunch of other chords that you can use, and in minor there's more of them. But let me just talk about this in major for a moment. So what is our mediant? Once we talk next week, and I'll talk about this more, and I'll just only mention it today, we have something called elaborative chords. And these are simply chords that can be used within the piece. They still will happen before a dominant, but they kind of elaborate within a prolongation. And that's why I'll talk about it next week. But all you need to know is that our elaborative chords, and I'm going to keep these, they're very, very similar to predominance. And in some ways they could be in the same category, but it's slightly different. But our elaborative chords is everything that goes before 5, whether it's when we're in a prolongation. So notice it's mostly the same chords we had before. Oh, and that should be the darker green, as well as the lighter green. Okay, so our sub-mediant actually in some ways is both a predominant and elaborative chord, as well as our sub-mediant. Sorry, as well as the tonic. So it can sometimes be the tonic. So that's what it looks like in major. Now, this is where things get interesting in minor, and I'm going to start the conversation in this video, and then I'm going to continue it in the second video for this class. So I'm going to keep those colors there so we can remember what they are. So let's start again. In minor, it's very similar to major. Let's start with the tonics. Our tonics, I'm going to put in blue. It's exactly the same, right? So we always begin and end on the tonic minor. Of course, in minor, we can sometimes end, on the tonic major, right? So that's our tierce stupidity. So don't forget about that. That still remains the same. But in our prolongations, you're going to find out that there are times when we can end a prolongation on the 6th chord, which would be our tonic, which would fill in for our tonic. Okay. But of course, at final cadences and where you need real confirmation of the tonic, it'll always be the 1 chord. Okay. And the Horton Richard textbook doesn't really talk about this, but I found it helpful to be thinking about it this ways. Then we have dominant, which I would normally show. The problem in minor is that our dominant minor chord is actually not a dominant function chord. We call it a dominant, but it's not a dominant function chord. In order for it to function as a tonic, we need that sharp scale degree 7. So in minor, when we don't add an accidental to it, so if we're just a natural minor, we don't have a dominant function chord at all. Okay, so notice I'm not going to put red in this at all. And I'm going to talk about that in video 2 when we talk about the dominant function chord. Now we have to move on to our elaborative chords. Okay. So our elaborative chords are, of course, in this darker green. No, sorry, not elaborate. We're going to talk about predominance first. So our predominant chords, the same in minor as in major. So we have a supertonic. Now it's diminished. So in minor, it can only be in first inversion, but we can still use it. Again, in minor, our subdominant minor and our submediant, which is in major now. So our 6th chord. Okay, so there's our cheering chords. Those are our pre-cadential dominants, or our cadential predominance, if we want to say it that way. I can't remember which way the Horton Ritchie textbook talks about it, but it basically has predominant in there and cadential. And so that would be and we're going to be using those and talking about those this week a lot. And now the elaborative chords, which will be talked about once we get into our prolongations. Our elaborative chords are now everything that's left. So you're going to notice that in minor, there is a lot more possibilities because of all these chords that haven't been used yet. So the minor dominant is an elaborative chord. The mediant, of course, the 3 chord is also, and the subtonic chord. This is a major chord, right? And it can be used as an elaborative chord in our prolongations. Of course, we'll talk about that. You don't have to worry about that for this week. We'll talk about that next week. And of course, our 6th chord is an elaborative chord, and our 2 in first inversion diminished chord is also an elaborative chord. So notice in minor, at the moment, without any alterations, and this is why when you do scales in minor, you do first a natural minor scale, then you do a harmonic minor scale where you have scale degree 7 raised, and you also sometimes do melodic minor scale where when you go up, scale degree 6 and 7 is raised. And when 6 and 7 is raised, that affects the 6 chord, the 4 chord, and the 2 chord, but we won't need to worry about that completely right now, although you will see this a little bit at the cadences because that's where we'll raise scale degree 6. So then when 6 is raised, you end up seeing a borrowing of the 4 chord and the 2 chord in particular from major, because that's where 6 is raised. Okay, and then you can't actually use the 6 when it's raised here because it alters the root, and then you have actually a diminished chord, which you can't use in root position, and the 6 must be in root position according to the Horton and Ritchie textbook at the final cadence. Okay, so I'm going to stop right there, and I just want to be clear again that you can see that there is no naturally occurring chord of dominant function in a minor key. And we'll talk about that in the next video more as we talk about chords of dominant function.